Hello everyone, welcome back to History 1151. In our last video, we discussed Jacksonian America and the people who created the egalitarian, democratic, but also white supremacist principles of Jacksonian democracy. We also discussed why people responded to Jacksonian democracy in the ways they did, why they might support the Whig Party, or why they might align themselves with the Democrats. In this video, we will consider the United States during the antebellum years, from about 1848 to 1860 and 1861. The word antebellum comes from the Latin words ante and bellum. Ante is for before, and bellum for war. So, when we use the word antebellum in the context of American history, we mean before the war, or before the Civil War. Antebellum has been associated with many things in U.S. society: art, fashion, architecture, and a way of life. Rather than mythologizing the antebellum period, as many have done in the past, in this course we will stick to the history and discuss what American life and society were really like in the years leading up to the Civil War. Between 1846 and 1848, the United States nearly doubled in size, gaining control of both the Oregon Country and the North American Southwest, after an agreement with British Canada and a war with Mexico. President James K. Polk, who had made these massive territorial gains possible, kept to his campaign promise of not seeking a second term of office, forcing the Democrats to find a new candidate to run for president in the 1848 election. The Democrats chose Lewis Cass of New Hampshire, who had acted as Andrew Jackson's Secretary of War. Cass had also seen military service during the War of 1812 as well. Martin Van Buren, the former U.S. president for the Democrats, ran as a third-party candidate. Van Buren ran with the Free Soil Party, a northern anti-slavery political faction. The Free Soil Party got support from anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats in the North, but also from abolitionists who had previously voted for the very small Liberty Party. The constituents of the Free Soil Party were politically diverse, but they were generally anti-slavery. The Whigs, in contrast to the Democrats and the Free Soilers, chose General Zachary Taylor, the hero of the U.S.-Mexican War, called Old Rough and Ready, as their nominee for president. Taylor had never held political office before, having spent most of his adult life in the U.S. Army, fighting in the War of 1812, the Black Hawk War, the Second Seminole War, and finally, the late conflict with Mexico. Taylor had not really been involved with the Whigs before 1848. He just knew that he disagreed with Andrew Jackson's policy of dissolving the Second Bank of the U.S., and he suggested that he preferred Henry Clay to James K. Polk in the 1844 election. As a military officer, Taylor was expected to maintain an apolitical stance and not make his political views known during his military service. Taylor even commented during the presidential campaign that he had never even bothered to vote before, although he may have just been saying this in order to sound humble. Taylor won the nomination of the Whigs and ran as a moderate for the party. Taylor was a Southerner, born in Virginia, and he owned a slave plantation in Louisiana. Abolitionist Whigs opposed Taylor on account of the fact that he was a slave owner, leading many to vote for the Free Soil Party. Southerners supported Taylor because he was a slave owner, but they worried that he would not defend slavery vigorously enough, or that he might allow slavery to be banned in the American Southwest. For vice president, the Whigs chose Millard Fillmore, a northerner from New York and an experienced Whig politician. With this balanced ticket, the Whigs won the presidential election of 1848, winning the largest share of the popular vote and taking states in both the North and the South. As president, Taylor tried to be moderate, rebuffing both anti- and pro-slavery politicians. He also believed that the office of the president should be weak, and the legislative branch of the U.S. government should be the most powerful. On the issue of the Mexican cession, Taylor, though he was a slave owner, hoped that slavery would be banned from the region, although he did not believe he had the authority to prohibit it himself. Now I want to talk about why the situation in the Western Territories was so complicated. The state of Texas, which was a slave state, was claiming large swaths of former Mexican territory in what was once the Mexican territory of Nuevo Mexico, now New Mexico, a U.S. territory. And as you can see from this map, much of the territory is north of the Missouri Compromise line, shown here. And Texas, of course, was already in the Union as a slave state. So what would happen to this territory here, which extends into what is now the states of Colorado and Wyoming, which did not exist yet, but were north of the Missouri Compromise line, where slavery was not permitted to exist. President Taylor, for his part, opposed the extension of slavery. Even though he had been a slave owner, he did not think that slavery was viable economically. He didn't think it would be successful in the Western Territories, and he hoped that slavery would not be permitted in the Southwest. He also had to deal with the fact that the Mormons had brought African slaves with them to the Utah Territory. The Utah Territory, of course, is north of the Missouri Compromise line, as you can see here. Utah is here, Missouri Compromise line is here. So there's questions about what to do with Texas's northern territorial holdings, and there's questions about what to do with the Mormons in the Utah Territory. And to a lesser degree, other forms of slavery existed in the North American Southwest. Native Americans and Mexicans both practiced a type of captive-taking slavery in which parties of Native Americans or parties of Mexicans would capture each other and make those captives into slaves. This is different than African slavery. It takes place under different circumstances, but Taylor certainly would have been aware of these developments as well. So all of these things complicate what will be done with the Western Territories, whether they will be slave or whether they will be free. The most complicated issue of all is California, because of the California Gold Rush, which we'll begin talking about in a moment. American settlers had been moving into the Southwest ever since the end of the U.S.-Mexican War. But the discovery of gold at John Sutter's mill in the mountains of central California greatly increased the speed of migration to the U.S. Pacific coast. In 1849, American prospectors who traveled to California, called 49ers, hoped to strike it rich on California gold. Because of the difficulties associated with traveling to California, either by sailing around South America or crossing the American West by horse and wagon, most of the prospectors expected to stay in the region after they had made it in the gold rush. Some prospectors did indeed find the mother lode and became very wealthy, buying large estates in the region. Most, however, did not become wealthy. They came to California for the gold, but stayed because they could not afford to leave. The people who had the best shot at making it in California were entrepreneurs who sold goods and offered services to the prospectors who had found gold. Immigrants like Levi Strauss, of German Jewish ancestry, sold tents and jeans, thick, rough cotton canvas trousers that were popular with prospectors, who called them drilling pants. Jeans would not be made of blue denim and have rivets until after the Civil War. Jeans were also not considered fashionable casual clothing in the way they are today. They were workwear. Women also had an excellent opportunity to make money and gain financial independence in the gold rush. Women ran hotels, stores, and boarding houses and provided services to the miners, most of whom were single males. The women who cooked for the California 49ers and did their laundry, and in some cases provided sex for money. Mexican California women, in particular, were able to make money off the mining industry, being that they were already living in California. Men also provided similar domestic services to their other male miners, violating the gender norms of the period. Immigrants from across the world came to California, hoping to find gold. In addition to Europeans, Peruvians, Chileans, and colonists from Russia and Alaska, Chinese immigrants, both male and female, came to California as well, working in the territory's burgeoning service economy, opening restaurants, laundries, and brothels. It should be noted, though, that most of the Chinese immigrants at this time were male. Now that we've talked about the California Gold Rush and the diverse group of people that took part in the California Gold Rush, including Chinese immigrants, I want to talk a little bit more about interethnic and interracial violence during the California Gold Rush. And some of these observations actually will apply after the gold rush has come to an end and California has become a U.S. state. So to begin, a diverse group of immigrants and migrants took part in the California Gold Rush. There were the aforementioned Chinese immigrants. There were immigrants from South America, places like Chile, for example. There were immigrants from Europe, like Germany, Basque people from Spain. And of course, there were migrants, Anglo-American migrants from the eastern United States. There were even some African Americans, too, some of whom were slaves, which is going to lead to some problems about California and its entrance into the Union. Should it be a free state or should it be a slave state? There were also Mexican people, immigrants who came up from Mexico. California had once been a part of Mexico, but after 1848, it became a part of the United States. But people came up from Mexico to take part in the gold rush. And of course, there were the Spanish-speaking Californios, people of Mexican descent who were living in California already. And then there were Native Americans who were living in the territory as well. And during the gold rush, you'll see violence both between groups. For example, Anglo-Americans against Californios or against Native Americans, for example. And then there's violence within groups as well. Anglo-Americans killing other Anglo-Americans, Chinese immigrants killing other Chinese immigrants. And the homicide rate was up to 250 per 100,000 adults per year, which is higher than other parts of the country at the time, but not as high as popular culture would suggest. And those statistics, I did not calculate those. They come from Randy Roth's American Homicide. And within this violence, this interracial, interethnic violence, racism certainly would have played a role in much of the violence, especially things like the California genocide against Native Americans, in which the state of California attempted to exterminate the Native American population of the state. Something that many Anglo-Americans would have supported, and even many Californios would have supported as well. Anglo-Americans tended to look down on Native Americans, but Spanish-speaking Californios also tended to look down on Native Americans. But within this violence, historians argue that other factors were important as well, besides just race and racism. They mention things like the mines playing out as the mines ran out of gold, tensions increased between the miners, as the former miners had to find new lines of employment. Alcohol consumption is mentioned as well. A low female population in the region. In some cases, as low as 1 woman for every 5 men. Women commit homicide at a lower rate than men do. So having more women in the population will make the overall homicide rate lower. Others point to firearms. Many of the miners living in California were veterans of the U.S.-Mexican War, and they were armed. Other miners and other people were armed as well. And others point to a lack of professional law enforcement and a lack of proper legal systems and court systems to prosecute crimes. And in the absence of professional law enforcement, in the absence of a court system to try defendants, people will turn to vigilantism and revenge attacks. And the last factor, which I think is also very important, is demographic changes. As a county in California, both as a territory and eventually later on as a state, as the demographics would change, as migrants or immigrants came in, the majority population would begin to become very nervous about their social standing. That would lead to an increase in violence. Violence against the minority groups coming in, but also violence within the majority. As the majority population becomes frustrated, they will lash out at the minorities, but also at each other. You'll also see violence on the part of minorities as well, especially as these minorities become larger and they want to have more power and more control. So the reasons for violence during the Gold Rush era are very complex, very multifaceted. And perhaps the most famous instance of violence during the California Gold Rush, besides the California genocide against Native Americans, would have been the Joaquin Murrieta affair. Joaquin Murrieta was a semi-mythical figure. According to legend and a 1854 pulp novel, Murrieta and his brother were accused of theft. His brother was lynched, according to some stories, and his wife was sexually assaulted by white Anglo-American miners who were jealous of Murrieta's success as a miner. And the legend goes that Murrieta, seeking vengeance, put together a gang which attacked the Anglo miners in revenge for what happened to his family. And again, the main source we have for this account of Murrieta's life, it comes from a 1854 pulp novel that is of debatable accuracy. There's a lot of sort of legends and folklore surrounding the character of Joaquin Murrieta. In reality, we don't know what happened to Murrieta's wife, and actually most of Murrieta's gang's victims were not white, they were Chinese. And Murrieta was eventually killed in 1853 by a Anglo-American, primarily Anglo-American posse that was put together. There was a bounty on Murrieta's head, and actually Murrieta was killed, and then his body was dismembered, and parts of his body were preserved in alcohol in jars and even put on display. There is some debate about Murrieta's identity, but I think that he was a real person, and I think there's just been a lot of folklore and mythology surrounding this figure. And for many people, he's become kind of a mythical anti-hero, particularly for Mexican-American people and Chicano people living in the Southwest. Many people in that region regard Murrieta as kind of the Mexican Robin Hood, while many Anglo-Americans and perhaps Chinese-Americans might regard Murrieta as a bandit who killed people indiscriminately. But Murrieta's story and the legends surrounding his actions would go on to inspire later Hispanic swashbucklers like Johnston Macaulay's Zorro character from the early 20th century, or William Goldman's Inigo Montoya. But now that we've discussed violence during the California Gold Rush, we'll turn our attention towards discussions of California's statehood. The influx of miners and other migrants to California made the question of its statehood more urgent. Should California enter as a slave state or a free state? Alta California, the former Mexican province, was bisected by the Missouri Compromise line, so maybe California should have been divided into a slave state in the south and a free state in the north. The California territorial government held a meeting in 1849 and voted to enter the Union as a free state, violating the Missouri Compromise line to the anger of pro-slavery forces in the U.S. government. President Taylor declared that California should not be barred from entering the Union, to the anger of the Southerners, who talked of going to war over the free states' admission. Enter Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Clay, a Whig senator from Kentucky, was himself a slave owner, but he did not want to see the needs of the slave power advanced over those of the country. So, Clay went to work putting together a compromise with the help of anti-slavery Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts and pro-slavery Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Calhoun died of tuberculosis during the negotiations. The deal that Clay worked out was as follows. 1. California would enter the Union as a free state. 2. Utah and New Mexico would be established as territories. Utah would continue to allow slavery, as the first Mormon pioneers had brought African slaves to the region back when it belonged to Mexico. And New Mexico would allow black slavery as well, although this institution never really caught on there. The residents of New Mexico, both Native American and Mexican, had a long tradition of enslaving captives they had taken in battle. So there was no desire to import enslaved African people. 3. The slave trade, not slavery itself, would be banned in the U.S. capital, the District of Columbia. 4. Texas, a slave state, would give up most of its territory north of the Missouri Compromise line, gaining its present shape in exchange for debt relief. 5. The most controversial part of the compromise. A strengthened version of the Fugitive Slave Act would be created. The nation had already passed legislation allowing for the recovery of escaped slaves, but the new Fugitive Slave Act would force northern free states' law enforcement to cooperate with federal marshals and southern slave catchers who had pursued escaped slaves into the north. The 1850 Compromise passed the House and Senate and was signed by President Millard Fillmore, who became president after Zachary Taylor suddenly died from a stomach illness just over a year into office. Before we continue our discussion of the Compromise of 1850 and its effects in the eastern United States, I want to mention other migrations that were taking place in the antebellum American West. In addition to California and other southwestern territories, Anglo-Americans were migrating to the Oregon country, which the U.S. had taken control of in 1846. At least the Oregon country that includes the states of Oregon and Washington. In order to reach the U.S. portion of the Oregon country, they had to travel across the American West using the Oregon Trail. The settlers for the Oregon Trail generally came from northern states, especially the Midwest, places like Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, and they traveled via Missouri across the prairies and across the Rocky Mountains, eventually reaching the rich, lush farmlands of what is now Oregon and Washington. These settlers were also joined by missionaries like Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, who you can see on this slide. The Whitmans wanted to bring Protestant Christianity to Native Americans in the Oregon country. Native Americans in the Oregon country already had experience with Christianity, particularly with Catholicism, but they practiced a very culturally syncretistic form of Christianity that mixed a lot of indigenous traditions and indigenous lifeways into Christianity. The Whitmans not only wanted to bring Protestant Christianity to Native Americans in the Oregon country, they also wanted Native Americans to adopt more Euro-American lifeways, particularly those related to agriculture. And eventually the Whitmans were killed in 1847 by members of the Cayuse tribe. And the Cayuse believed that Whitman, who was a physician as well, they believed that Whitman was practicing bad medicine, that he was spreading diseases like measles to Native Americans, which white settlers spread diseases to Native Americans, but it doesn't appear that Whitman was doing this on purpose. So his death was not deserved in this case. But his death and the death of his wife take place on the backdrop of increasing white settlement in the Oregon country, diseases that are being spread in the region, and just the encroachment of white settlers on Native American lands, the forced acculturation of Native Americans. I'm not justifying the killing of the Whitmans. I'm explaining the context in which these killings took place. And their deaths will lead to a war with the Cayuse, in which many Cayuse will be killed, and then the men who murdered the Whitmans will be executed for the killing of the two white missionaries, the Whitmans. Other things to note about the Oregon country, specifically about Oregon: slavery was illegal in these territories because of the Missouri Compromise. And when Oregon became a state in 1859, they actually forbade black people from entering the state and settling there as free people. So it was meant to be a place for white settlers only. Also, we should keep in mind the difficulties associated with the traveling to the Oregon country. The Oregon Trail was an extremely hard road, long stretches where there's little to no people to interact with. Resupply could be very difficult for the Oregon Trail migrants who traveled in Conestoga wagons across the West. They often ran out of food. They had to traverse dry prairies where there was very little water, the steep Rocky Mountains, where accidents could happen very frequently. They had to avoid Native American war parties who did not take kindly to these settlers interloping in their territory, and things like disease and malnutrition from a very poor diet during the journey would have claimed a lot of lives. So this would have been a very difficult journey for those that were willing to try to go and set up a new life in Oregon. And the challenges of the journey, it led to creations like the Oregon Trail video game seen here at the bottom of the slide, which some of you may have played before. Lastly, a couple of stats. This journey is over 2,000 miles long. The travelers in their wagons, traveling over dirt roads and wagon paths, are going as high as 7,000 feet above sea level, so very easy to have a wagon accident in which you lose control of your wagon in the mountains, being washed away by rivers, diseases, attacks. It's estimated that about 10% of the people that went on this journey did not make it. They died along the way, so it's a very challenging journey for the Oregon pioneers. And once they reach the Oregon country, then they're living amongst Native Americans, many of whom resent their presence for a variety of reasons which are very understandable. In addition to being extremely controversial, the new Fugitive Slave Act changed how enslaved African Americans who wanted to escape from slavery sought to gain their freedom. Before the 1850 Compromise, fugitive slaves were fairly safe from capture in the northern free states, as long as they blended in with the state's free black population and avoided being too conspicuous. They could usually avoid capture. If they were captured, slave catchers had to work with uncooperative northern law enforcement to get them to sign off on the return of the escaped slave, who was now a resident of a free state. Additionally, many northern states had enacted personal liberty laws, which held that anyone living in their state was free. The 1850 Compromise overrode these states' laws, taking away many northerners' states' rights, subordinating them to federal law. This law angered northerners, white and black, including white northerners who were abolitionists, but did not want to see federal resources be used for the return of southern slaves. Enslaved people in the South now realized that just escaping to the North was no longer a good option. They would have to run further and leave the United States for Canada, which, being part of the British Empire, had outlawed slavery in 1833. Enslaved people on the run in the North traveled along the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a network of people, both white and black, who helped escaped slaves reach freedom in Canada. Underground Railroad operatives were called conductors, and the hideaways where they hid escaped slaves were called stations. The Underground Railroad had the most stations and conductors in the Great Lakes region, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, since they were close to the upper southern slave states of Kentucky and Missouri. The Canadian border extended further to the south in this region as well. The Underground Railroad conductors guided parties of escaped slaves northward and hid them in barns, swamps, basements, and in some cases, sophisticated secret compartments with false walls. The conductors used special codes to signal that the path was safe, or that slave catchers and marshals were on the prowl. One of the best ways they could symbolize safety or danger was through quilts. Certain patterns indicated a safe harbor. Other designs meant keep moving. Harriet Beecher Stowe, a white abolitionist author from Connecticut, penned the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. Uncle Tom's Cabin told the story of enslaved people, particularly in their attempts to escape along the Underground Railroad. While the novel has been criticized today for both its sentimental language and its use of negative racial stereotypes, Stowe's book raised awareness for the plight of slaves among white Americans in the North. The novel was an international bestseller as well, being particularly popular in Great Britain. At the same time, the novel angered and embarrassed white Southerners who attacked Stowe's work. They also wrote their own imitation novels that portrayed slaves as content with their bondage and dutiful to their masters. The novel was polarizing, further deepening the sectional divide. Abraham Lincoln, who met Stowe in 1862, after the Civil War had begun, famously said, "So this is the little woman who started this great war." One of the most famous Underground Railroad conductors was Harriet Tubman, an escaped slave from Maryland. Tubman escaped from slavery in 1849. In spite of the toughening of the Fugitive Slave Act, Tubman risked her freedom and traveled back to the South 13 times, rescuing over 70 enslaved people over the course of 8 years, although some think that she may have rescued as many as 300. Contrary to popular mythology, Harriet Tubman did not have a $40,000, $1.5 million today, bounty placed on her head. Rather, slave owners believed that a white abolitionist was enticing their slaves to escape to freedom. They could not believe that a black woman could have such influence over their slaves. On her treks, Tubman used disguises to hide her identity, something that escaped slaves had been doing for centuries. Tubman also carried a revolver to protect her party from slave catchers and their dogs, but also to keep other slaves from abandoning the group, which might lead to the entire party's capture. Tubman also used code words and phrases, many of which came from the Bible, to signal that she was an Underground Railroad conductor. For her courage, Harriet Tubman has been described as the Moses of the African American people. It should also be noted that enslaved people who wanted to escape to freedom did not always run northward. The slaves that fled along the Underground Railroad we discussed before were usually from upper South states like Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. Slaves in the Deep South had a much longer road to traverse if they wanted to escape to Canada. Instead, slaves in the Deep South went to other destinations. Slaves in Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina would escape to Florida and live amongst the Seminoles in the Everglades. Others sailed across the Straits of Florida into the Bahamas, a part of the British Empire. Slaves in Texas fled south and west to Mexico, where African slavery was illegal. Runaway slaves also fled west to the frontier, where some joined Native American tribes. The Native Americans of the Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, did enslave black people, but other tribes did not. Sometimes enslaved people ran away, not to permanently escape slavery, but to convince their masters to treat them better. This custom was called lying out. Scholars argue that another reason the United States had comparatively few slave revolts was not because American masters really treated their slaves that much better than masters in other parts of the Americas. In addition to the fact that most slaves had been born in the U.S., and that black people were a minority, no more than 20% of the U.S.'s population at the time, it was far easier for American slaves to resist slavery by simply running away, rather than fomenting a rebellion which would most likely fail and end in the death of all the conspirators. Slave masters had a paternalistic view of the institution of slavery, seeing it as benevolent to black people, who were supposed to be inferior to whites. They could not imagine why their slaves, their quote-unquote black family, would run away. Some even believed that their slaves' desire for freedom was a mental disorder, which they called drapetomania. We'll talk a little bit more about slave rebellions later in this video. In 1852, Millard Fillmore, who took over after President Taylor's death, failed to win the Whig nomination for president. Fillmore was a Northerner, but he was supported by Southern pro-slavery Whigs because he had signed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Instead, the Whigs chose Winfield Scott as their presidential nominee. Scott was a Virginian and a decorated Mexican war hero like Zachary Taylor, but Scott has a stronger anti-slavery reputation than Taylor, so he was a desirable choice for anti-slavery Whigs, who viewed Scott as a compromise candidate. By the way, I think Millard Fillmore looks a lot like Alec Baldwin. The Democrats chose Franklin Pierce, a congressman and senator from New Hampshire. Pierce had also served in the U.S.-Mexican War as an officer of volunteer soldiers. He was a career politician and a short-term soldier. In terms of his political views, Pierce was staunchly anti-abolitionist, believing that the radicals of the anti-slavery movement were a threat to the Union. Other political parties ran the 1852 election as well, but failed to gain much ground, except for the Free Soil Party, led by John Hale, the senator from New Hampshire. The Free Soil Party siphoned votes away from the Whigs in the Northeast. On the whole, the campaign of the 1852 presidential election lacked much substance. Neither Scott nor Pierce discussed their agendas in much detail. Campaign managers mostly focused on attacking the character of their opponents. Scott was attacked for being a foppish old man, old fuss and feathers, as he had been called during his army days, for his strict adherence to military discipline. Pierce, who was considered to be young and attractive, in contrast to Scott, was attacked for being vain, effete, and vacuous. Although the American electorate seemed unenthused with either candidate, voter turnout was lower in 1852 than it had been in 1848. Pierce won commandingly in the popular vote, and in a landslide in an electoral college, taking all of the states except Vermont, Massachusetts, Kentucky, and Tennessee. As president, Franklin Pierce, like his predecessors, was a weak executive who had no interest in challenging the pro-slavery forces in the South. Some scholars think the gruesome death of his 11-year-old son Benjamin, who was decapitated in a train crash, made Pierce depressed and had a detrimental effect on his presidency. In other ways, though, Pierce stuck to his previous political views as president. Pierce supported the Ostend Manifesto, an attempt by pro-slavery U.S. ambassadors to purchase Cuba from Spain and threaten war if Spain refused. The ambassadors wanted to turn Cuba into at least 2 new slave states. When the manifesto became public in 1854, Pierce's administration lost much of its credibility in the eyes of anti-slavery Americans. Even though the Pierce administration's plans to increase the number of slave states through the acquisition of territory in Latin America failed, individual Americans would continue their efforts to take control of territory in the region through filibustering. To make matters worse, President Pierce signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 after it had passed through Congress. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was proposed by Stephen A. Douglas, a Democratic senator from Illinois. Douglas wanted to hasten the settlement of the Western territories. These territories you can see in yellow here, partially because he wanted to facilitate railroad development and investment in the West. On a related note, one of the reasons that the United States bought the Gadsden Purchase of 1853 was to encourage the construction of a southern transcontinental railroad. The first transcontinental railroad that was completed, actually, its line was much further to the north. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was based on the idea of popular sovereignty, something that Senator Douglas, or Stephen Douglas, had been in favor of for many years in deciding what would happen with Western territories. And popular sovereignty, in many ways, is actually pretty democratic. It said that the white male voters in a territory would vote on whether that territory would enter the Union as a free state or a slave state. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively overturned the 1820 Missouri Compromise line, which said that slavery could not exist or be legal north of this line here, the southern border of Missouri. As you know, the U.S.-Mexican War and the territories that come in as a result of that conflict will complicate the Missouri Compromise line. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the Utah settlers had brought enslaved people with them to the Utah territory in 1847. So African slavery was already existing in a small capacity north of the Missouri Compromise line. As I also mentioned, other types of unfree labor were common in the Southwest. Enslavement of Native Americans, enslavement of Mexicans. These certainly would have been factors as well. But the biggest issue, I think, is with the Kansas-Nebraska Act's passage, pro-slavery settlers will have a much greater advantage in moving to these western territories and leading to these territories becoming slave states. They don't have to travel as far. Pro-slavery forces will come from Missouri into the Kansas territory. It's a very short journey, whereas free staters will have to come from much further to the north. And that's exactly what happens. The pro-slavery forces, often known as the Border Ruffians, will cross from Missouri into Kansas. Some will settle in Kansas. Others will stay in Missouri and will just go over to Kansas to vote illegally, to commit voter fraud and things like that. The free staters, it's going to take them much longer to reach the Kansas territory. And as these groups, the pro-slavery Border Ruffians, the anti-slavery free staters, begin to arrive in Kansas, there's violence between both factions. There's guerrilla warfare. There's attacks on civilians in what is called Bleeding Kansas. And Bleeding Kansas will continue up to, and I would argue, into the U.S. Civil War. The nature of the violence in Kansas was very much on a community level, a lot of violence against civilians, a lot of guerrilla warfare, a lot of unconventional and irregular warfare that will continue well into the Civil War. As president, Pierce will support the pro-slavery faction, the Border Ruffian faction, in the Kansas territory. And actually, both factions will create rival governments in the Kansas territory. In the end, though, Kansas will enter the Union as a free state on January 29, 1861, as the Confederate states, the southern states, are leaving the Union and joining the Confederacy. In the end, more free staters, more anti-slavery people went to Kansas. Other states out west will not join the Union until much later. Utah is not going to join the Union until January 4th, 1896. Utah is going to give up large portions of its territory that will become the states of Wyoming and part of Wyoming and then part of Nevada. Nevada will become its own territory in 1861, and then it will enter the Union as a free state, obviously, in 1864 during the U.S. Civil War. A far bigger reason that Utah is so slow to enter the Union is debates or struggles with the U.S. government and the Mormon Church, particularly over things like polygamy. Arizona and New Mexico would both become states in 1912. That is some additional background on the Western Territories and how they became states. We'll continue our discussion of Antebellum America and the Franklin Pierce presidency now. After the signing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, pro-slavery Missourians would cross over into Kansas territory to vote in the territorial elections. Meanwhile, Northerners entered the state as well. Both the pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions in the territory set up their own rival governments. The pro-slavery people ruled from Lecompton, and the anti-slavery government ruled from Topeka, and also from Lawrence. Pierce recognized the pro-slavery government as the legitimate one, leading to a violent miniature civil war between the pro- and anti-slavery factions in the territory. This fighting would be called Bleeding Kansas, and would continue, in one form or another, through the Civil War. Both parties violently attacked each other and targeted civilians. One such insurgent in Bleeding Kansas was John Brown, a tall, skinny, steely-eyed abolitionist from Connecticut. Brown and his sons assassinated several pro-slavery leaders in Kansas, hacking their enemies' bodies apart with broadswords. Brown and his sons also stole horses from their opponents, among other crimes. Even many abolitionists thought Brown was too fanatical in his fight against slavery, and many of his contemporaries thought he was crazy. We will talk more about John Brown later. Kansas eventually joined the Union in January of 1861, but did so as a free state. Pierce's giving in to the pro-slavery interests in Kansas also damaged his reputation among northern anti-slavery people, both outside and within the Democratic Party. In 1854, Pierce's stock in the eyes of abolitionists would fall even further. Anthony Burns, an enslaved black man from Richmond, Virginia, stowed away aboard a ship bound for Boston in February of 1854. Burns hid in a small, cramped compartment for 3 weeks before emerging in Boston. Burns only got to experience freedom for 1 month before the bounty hunters caught up with him. Burns had written a letter home, which had been intercepted by his master, giving the slave catchers a clue as to where he'd gone. In response, his master petitioned for Burns' arrest. The Boston police were forced to cooperate because of the Fugitive Slave Act. Burns was put on trial in the Boston court, and the judge determined that the bounty hunter had produced enough evidence to prove that Burns was an escaped slave. Boston was undoubtedly the most abolitionist city in the United States, and word of Burns' transfer back to the South caused a riot outside of the courthouse, as an abolitionist mob tried to free Burns from custody. President Pierce, for his part, supported Burns' return to slavery, and even sent the U.S. Marines into Boston to restore order in the wake of the riot. Because he was a Northerner who supported slavery, Pierce was called a doughface for being weak and malleable and acting against his region's interests. Violence over slavery was not confined to the Kansas Territory or the streets of Boston during Pierce's term, though. On the floor of the Senate chamber, Preston Brooks, a Democratic congressman from South Carolina, attacked Charles Sumner, a Free Soil/Republican senator from Massachusetts. Sumner had delivered a speech excoriating pro-slavery politicians like Andrew Butler, the Democratic senator from South Carolina. Sumner declared that slaveholding politicians like Butler had, quote-unquote, raped the Virgin Territory of Kansas. He also specifically attacked Butler, suggesting that he had embraced slavery as if it were a prostitute. This insult had a double meaning, implying that Butler had sexual relations with his female slaves. Even the suggestion of interracial sexual relationships, miscegenation in the contemporary parlance, was an extreme insult. Because of his fiery, invective-laden speech, Senator Sumner drew ire from Preston Brooks, a young Democratic congressman from South Carolina, who was a cousin of Senator Butler. Brooks decided that Sumner was not honorable enough to be challenged to a duel because of the coarse, ungentlemanly language he had used. As discussed before, white Southern males had a strict code of honor, and dueling was considered to be a challenge by which men of equal stature could reaffirm their senses of honor and masculinity. On May 22, 1856, Brooks confronted Sumner on the Senate floor, saying in a thick South Carolinian drawl, "Senator Sumner, I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who is a relative of mine." Then he struck Sumner on the head with a thick gutta-percha walking cane. Blindsided by the attack, Sumner was unable to fight back and was nearly killed by Brooks, who continued to beat Sumner, leaving him bloody and unconscious. Brooks only left off his attack after other senators intervened. In the end, Sumner, although he survived, probably sustained a traumatic brain injury, taking 3 years to fully recover from the attack. He became a sort of martyr for anti-slavery Northerners. Brooks, in contrast, became a hero to pro-slavery Southerners. Because of his unpopularity, the embattled Franklin Pierce failed to win the Democratic Party's nomination for president in the 1856 election. Ironically, the Democrats chose a man with a similar background and set of beliefs as Pierce. The Democrats nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, the former U.S. Secretary of State and Foreign Minister to Great Britain. Like his predecessor, Pierce, Buchanan was a quote-unquote northern man of southern inclinations. Buchanan had helped to broker the Ostend Manifesto during his time as ambassador. And Buchanan supported popular sovereignty, believing that slavery should be allowed to expand into the West. Buchanan also promised to only serve one term as president. In the aftermath of the 1852 election, the Whig Party collapsed due to disagreements over the issue of slavery, among other things. In its place, the Republican Party was born. The Republicans took much of their political ideology, the emphasis on internal improvements, banks, wage labor, and commerce, from the Whigs, and they added a more anti-slavery stance, drawing supporters from Martin Van Buren's also defunct Free Soil Party. The Republicans in the 1856 election promised to keep the institution of slavery out of the Western territories, but agreed to allow slavery to continue where it already existed. The Republicans promised free soil, free labor, and free men to potential voters. The Democrats responded to the Republicans by attacking them for being the party of radicals, reformers, abolitionists, and African Americans, as you can see by this political cartoon. Conversely, this is a political cartoon from 1856. It comes from either a Free Soil or Republican perspective. It shows the Democratic Party or Democratic Party politicians. In this case, it shows Stephen A. Douglas, former President Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, who was elected president in the 1856 election, and Lewis Cass, another important Democratic Party politician, forcing slavery in the form of a black person down the throat of a white pioneer living in the Kansas or Nebraska territories. Meanwhile, you see violence, murder, bleeding Kansas taking place in the background. And this cartoon, I think, is very interesting because it shows that the Free Soilers and the Republicans, they may have been against slavery being spread to the Western territories, but they're certainly not pro-African American. When they said free soil, free labor, free men, they meant free soil and free labor for white men. They did not want slavery in the Western territories because they did not want African Americans in the Western territories. Of course, the Republican Party's stances on African Americans will change with time. While the Republican Party appealed to many Northern abolitionists, it is important to keep in mind that the party did not oppose slavery for entirely altruistic, anti-racist reasons. In fact, the Republicans were very much a product of their time when it came to racial beliefs. The Republicans opposed the extension of slavery because they did not want black people to settle in the West, preferring to keep the region open for white settlement. The Republicans also opposed further annexation of territory in Latin America because they did not want non-white Latinos to become U.S. citizens, as had been done with the people living in the Mexican Cession in the Southwest. Republicans disliked slavery, not primarily for its violence against black people, but because they thought slavery made white people lazy, threatening free wage labor by allowing white people to live off the work of slaves. For their nominee, the Republicans chose John C. Fremont of Georgia, an explorer, a veteran of the U.S.-Mexican War, and former military governor of California. Fremont, in contrast to Buchanan, was a Southern man of Northern inclinations. Fremont opposed the extension of slavery, and he thought that the fugitive slave law should not be enforced. While Fremont was forward-thinking on slavery, he was less so on Indian rights, having participated in the attempted genocide of California Native Americans in the late 1840s and early 1850s. A third political party, called the Native American Party, also called the Know-Nothings, participated in the 1856 election, running former President Millard Fillmore as their candidate. As their name implied, the Native American Party ran on an anti-immigrant platform and was strongest in the Northeast, which had the largest immigrant population in the U.S. at the time. At this time, most of the immigrants coming to America were from Western Europe, namely Ireland and the German states. In terms of push factors, Irish immigrants had fled the potato famine of 1845 through 1849, and they continued to come to the country in large numbers in the 1850s. Pull factors were ample jobs and land in the U.S. Irish immigrants tended to vote for the Democratic Party when they became citizens, and they supported the Southern pro-slavery wing of the party because they saw African Americans, both free blacks and escaped slaves, as competitors for jobs. The Irish immigrants tended to be poor and destitute, and mostly worked lower-level wage labor jobs. The Irish were also Catholic, which angered Anglo-American Protestants, who still feared that the Catholics might try to take over the country to create a papal theocracy. German immigrants had also been coming to America in greater numbers as well. Their push factor was the 1848 revolution. Germans who had been on the losing side of the revolution fled to the U.S. seeking political freedom as a pull factor. Fleeing persecution in their homelands was a push factor. The German immigrants tended to be more middle class than the Irish. The Germans were mostly Protestant, but many were Catholic or Jewish as well. While the Irish could speak English, the Germans usually could not. Anglo-Americans looked on the Irish and German immigrants and resented their migration to the United States. They feared economic competition from the immigrants, but they hated the fact that the Irish were Catholic and that the Germans, or Dutchmen, as they were called, did not speak English. They also feared that German immigrants, fleeing the failed 1848 revolution, were bringing radical ideas like socialism or communism, as articulated by Karl Marx, to the United States. In truth, many German immigrants did support these ideologies. In some ways, America's first Red Scare happened in the 1850s, not in the 20th century, as most people seem to think. Many native-born white Americans believed that the Irish and German immigrants were not truly white, and they believed that only Americans of Anglo-Saxon, English ancestry had a right to whiteness. Americans who disliked increased immigration due to xenophobia or other reasons tended to vote for the nativist Know-Nothings in the 1856 election. In the end, James Buchanan and the Democrats won the 1856 election. The Democrats attacked Fremont's French-Canadian heritage and suggested that he was a closet Catholic, playing to Americans' xenophobic and anti-papist beliefs. At the same time, the Democrats pushed to naturalize immigrants, mostly Irish in the Northeast, primarily in New York and Pennsylvania, so that they could vote. Irish immigrants, as I said before, once they became citizens, tended to vote Democrat. German immigrants were more likely to vote Republican once they had achieved citizenship. The Republicans also lost crucial votes in the North, not only to the Democrats, but to the Know-Nothings as well. As president, James Buchanan promised to not get in the way of the extension of slavery in the West, continuing the dough-faced policies of Franklin Pierce. As an aside, James Buchanan was the only U.S. president to have served in the military as an enlisted man, fighting in the Chesapeake region during the War of 1812. All other presidents who had military experience had been officers during their service. Additionally, Buchanan was the only U.S. president to have been a lifelong bachelor. Buchanan never married a woman, leading some scholars to suggest that he might have secretly been gay. From 1856 to 1857, and indeed for years before, Dred Scott, an enslaved black man, sued for his freedom before the Supreme Court. Years before, Scott, then owned by a U.S. Army surgeon, Dr. John Emerson, had been taken from the slave state of Missouri to the Wisconsin Territory, which was not yet a state, but was a free territory due to the Missouri Compromise. On this basis, Scott argued that since he had lived in territory where slavery was illegal, he should be considered a free man. Scott and his family had also been living basically as free people ever since Dr. Emerson's death. Dr. Emerson's widow had refused to allow Scott to purchase his freedom or the freedom of his wife and daughter. Scott had married his wife in Wisconsin, and his daughter had been born aboard ship on the Mississippi River between Illinois and Iowa, free territory. Scott's case made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and his argument for freedom was very compelling and had strong judicial precedent. His master had violated federal law by taking an enslaved person into free territory, and Scott had basically lived as a free man since his master's death, suggesting that his master's widow did not have the ability to hold him as an enslaved person. Nonetheless, the U.S. Supreme Court, led by the aggressively pro-slavery Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, determined that Smith must remain a slave. The Dred Scott case was significant for two reasons. First, it was significant because it continued to undermine the Missouri Compromise by arguing that Scott's enslavement did not end when he left the slave state for free territory. Second, the case was significant because Taney and the court, in order to justify Scott's enslavement, argued that black people could never be citizens of the United States and were thus not entitled to the same political rights as white people. Taney's court opinion, had it been passed into law, would have essentially prevented black people from ever getting citizenship in the United States. For his part, President Buchanan supported the Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case. Anti-slavery Northerners opposed the court's decision because they feared it would set a precedent that would lead to the reintroduction of slavery in the Northern free states, since Dred Scott's enslavement in the free Wisconsin Territory had been declared legal. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and the Dred Scott case of 1857 convinced Americans of a variety of perspectives that the United States would become either all free or all slave, and that a conflict over the institution was imminent. The Dred Scott case, in spite of its implications, was not the most controversial thing to happen during the Buchanan administration. John Brown, the Yankee abolitionist, who had fought in the Bleeding Kansas insurgency, planned to start a mass slave uprising in Virginia in 1859. Brown planned to seize a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Now it's in West Virginia. Using the weapons taken from the arsenal, Brown and his co-conspirators, most of whom were his sons and followers, would distribute the arms they had seized to slaves, who would then rise up against the institution of slavery. Brown hoped that with enough weapons, his insurrection would spread across the South and end the institution of slavery. Brown led a small army of 22 men, 15 of whom were white and 7 of whom were black. Brown invited key black abolitionists like the escaped slave Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, discussed before, to join his mission. They both refused to take part. Tubman was prevented by illness, and Douglass thought the insurrection would fail. Remember, slave revolts in the United States had always failed, so Douglass's concern was not unfounded. On October 16th, Brown and his followers arrived at Harper's Ferry. They killed Hayward Shepard, a free black railroad porter, who ran away from the raiders. Shepard himself did not know about the revolt, and probably thought that Brown and his men were train robbers, hence his decision to run away. Brown took several white people hostages and freed several slaves, but the free slaves declined to join his planned revolt. Brown distributed the weapons he had brought to Virginia, along with those taken from the arsenal, but African Americans did not rise up to join him as he had hoped. To make matters worse, technology like railroads and the telegraph were used to quickly alert the state and federal government of Brown's raid. On the 17th of October, after some shootouts with Virginia forces, Brown and his conspirators, becoming desperate, took several of the arsenal workers hostage and garrisoned themselves in the Army's fire engine house, basically a large garage. Local militia companies had begun to arrive at Harper's Ferry, getting into shootouts with Brown's raiders, as I mentioned before. Federal troops, in the form of the U.S. Marines, arrived in the town as well. The federal troops were commanded by Colonel Robert E. Lee, who was still an officer in the U.S. Army. On the morning of the 18th of October, the Marines assaulted the engine house and broke down the door. Over the course of 3 minutes, the Marines seized control of the building, killing 2 of the conspirators while losing 2 casualties themselves. They then captured Brown and the remaining conspirators and freed the hostages. Brown himself had been wounded in the fight. Brown was arrested, jailed, and charged with treason, murder, and incitement of a slave insurrection, all of which were capital offenses. He was tried and found guilty on all counts. John Brown went to his death on December 2, 1859. In his final moments, Brown remained fearless and defiant. In his last words, he prophetically declared that he now saw that the evil of slavery would only be removed from the country through bloodshed. 7 more conspirators would be executed. 10 had died during the course of the attempted revolt, and 5 had managed to escape. Only 2 Virginian blacks joined Brown. 1 was killed, and the other died in jail. In the South, John Brown's raid angered white Southerners, who feared future slave insurrections. In the North, opinion was divided on Brown. Most Northerners condemned Brown's violent actions, seeing his planned insurrection as counterproductive to the goal of ending slavery, if they wanted to see slavery ended. Even some abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison, held this opinion. Frederick Douglass supported Brown's ideals, but he thought that his planned revolt would fail. Others transformed John Brown into a martyr. John Brown's raid, though it failed and was suppressed by both state and federal forces, further divided the nation over the issue of slavery. Going into the 1860 U.S. presidential election, tensions between the South and the North over slavery were at an all-time high. The Republican Party tried to address these tensions in the election with their choice of Abraham Lincoln, the former congressman from Illinois, as their candidate for president. Lincoln had minimal political experience, having lost his bid for senator in 1858 to Democrat Stephen Douglas, author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Lincoln, however, was a good choice because he came from a western state, Illinois. Lincoln also had a frontier background, being born in Kentucky in 1809 and serving in the Black Hawk War. Though he had little formal education, Lincoln was a skilled debater and orator. He was also considered by contemporaries to be a moderate on slavery, unlike other Republican presidential contenders, like William Seward of New York, who was more aggressively anti-slavery. Lincoln ran on the platform of keeping slavery out of the Western territories, but allowing it to exist where it currently resided, seen as a compromise at the time, at least to Northerners. The Democratic Party, unlike the Republicans, was divided over the issue of slavery. Northern Democrats tended to support Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's former political opponent, who, though he was the author of Popular Sovereignty, was not aggressively pro-slavery. Southern Democrats favored John C. Breckinridge, a senator from Kentucky, and Buchanan's VP. Breckinridge wanted slavery to be specifically mentioned and protected by the U.S. government in the Constitution. Former Whigs and people who disliked both the Democratic and the Republican parties supported John Bell of Tennessee and his Constitutional Union Party, which was very similar to the old Whig Party. The Know Nothing Party had collapsed in the 1856 election and did not run in 1860. Other smaller parties ran as well, but failed to win any states. In the end, Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 presidential election, carrying a plurality of the popular vote, just under 40%. Lincoln won all of the northern states, and he also picked up the new western states of California and Oregon, which had become a state in 1859. Lincoln was able to win in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the western frontier states due to his Jacksonian style and persona, even if he advocated a Republican Party platform. Lincoln, however, did not appear on the ballot in many southern states. Breckinridge and the Southern Democrats won all of the southern states, except for Missouri, which went to Douglas and the Northern Democrats, and Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia, which Bell's Constitutional Union Party took. Lincoln won the majority, 180 of the votes in the Electoral College. Even if the Democrats had not split their vote and had been able to win the states taken by Bell and the Constitutional Union Party, they probably still would have lost the election. The North had grown faster than the South. Its already larger population was growing at a more rapid rate, and thus gaining more delegates in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. Immigrants tended to enter the U.S. through northern ports, like Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia, and they tended to either remain in the North or migrate to the West. The South was a less desirable place for immigrants to settle. due to the fact that slavery provided all of the inexpensive labor that the region needed. Western Americans were increasingly voting for the free soil, free labor, free men ideology of the Republicans, as opposed to the older pro-slavery Jacksonianism of the Democrats. The only way the Democrats could have won in 1860 would have been to win all of the constitutional Union states and win a handful of the more populous northern states, like a New York or a Pennsylvania, which still had sizable Democratic immigrant voter coalitions. The problem was, no such unifying Democratic candidate existed in the 1860 election. In response to Lincoln's winning of the election and his impending inauguration, the Deep South states of South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana and Texas held conventions to secede from the Union between December 20th, 1860 and February 1st, 1861. On February 4th, the Congress of the Confederate States of America would elect Jefferson Davis, a former Democratic senator from Mississippi, as the seceded state's president. By the way, Davis was originally from Kentucky, like Lincoln, and he had previously served in the U.S. military and fought in the Mexican-American War. Several other states, including Arkansas, Missouri, North Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee, held secession conventions or votes, but these initial attempts to secede failed. In the end, Arkansas, Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina would secede from the Union and join the Confederate States of America. Upper South slave states were more hesitant about seceding from the Union than the Deep South states. Upper Southern states had the institution of slavery, but the Upper Southern states' economies were far more varied, having plantation agriculture, food crop agriculture, resource extraction, and some industrialization, less so than the North, but more than the Deep South, where there was less interest in investing in factories. Additionally, Southern culture was distinct from the culture of the Northern states, but there were different cultures within the South as well. Think back to our discussions of colonial America and the different ethnic groups that came from Europe and settled in the Southern colonies versus those in the Mid-Atlantic and New England. Also remember the groups of people that settled the Appalachian Mountain corridor as well, which runs into the South. The Appalachians also run to the north, going all the way up to Canada, but they are much wider and more extensive in the South than they are in the North. Slavery, in all of its forms, would impact the culture of both the Deep and the Upper South, although slavery had less of a presence in the Upper Southern and mountainous Appalachian territories in the South, leading to a slightly different version of Southern culture. In parts of the Deep South, where most of the enslaved people were held by a handful of wealthy white plantation owners, the culture was different than regions in the South where slaves were held in smaller numbers by a much higher number of white people. Essentially, plantation slavery was very different than small household slavery. By the way, do not assume that enslaved people living on small farms, often in the same home as their white masters, had a better life than their counterparts on the large plantations. Sources produced by both whites and blacks have shown that plantation slaves, because they were surrounded by other black people, had an easier time avoiding abuse from masters and overseers. It also would have taken a plantation master far longer to notice the absence of an escaped slave on a plantation than it would for a small slave owner to notice an enslaved person had fled his household or her household. Southern culture would also vary across the South based on the number of African Americans. In places like the Carolina coast, where black people outnumbered whites, African Americans were able to maintain more of their ancestors' African traditions, as seen in our previous discussion of the Gullah people. In parts of the South where there were very few black people, usually because the region was unfit for plantation slavery, like the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina and East Tennessee, European, especially Scotch-Irish cultural traditions had a much greater impact on the regional culture. The South, with its various regions, had long been culturally distinct from the North, but the entire region did not have enough of a reason to break off from the rest of the country until the election of Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the spread of slavery into the West. The deep Southerners saw the prohibition of slavery expansion into the West as a genuine threat to slavery in the Deep South. This is because plantation agriculture, especially cotton growing, would wear out the soil very quickly, and slavery would have to expand into the West where new plantations could be built. Otherwise, there would be nothing to farm, and no money could be made by the plantation owners. The more reluctant upper southern slave states were not as worried about slavery coming to an end in their region because their economies were less dependent on slavery, and the ratio of whites to blacks was higher as well. Nonetheless, other political developments would motivate Arkansas, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee to secede from the Union and join the Confederate States of America. In response to the Deep South's secession from the Union, Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky, a constitutional unionist, proposed a series of constitutional amendments and legislation that would protect and sanction the institution of slavery. Crittenden proposed that slavery would be permitted in every state where it currently existed, but that it would only be allowed in territories south of the 36-30 Missouri Compromise line of 1820, which had been undone by developments like the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act and the 1856 and 57 Dred Scott case. Others proposed adding a 13th Amendment to the Constitution that would specifically mention and protect the institution of slavery. President-elect Lincoln opposed the Crittenden Compromise because it would have allowed the expansion of slavery, though in a smaller geographical region than was allowed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Remember, Lincoln and the Republicans' leading policy was to ban the extension of slavery into any new states. The Crittenden Compromise was not anti-slavery enough for Northerners, nor pro-slavery enough for Southerners, so the bill never passed into law, and slavery never made it into the Constitution, thankfully. Crittenden would offer another compromise in February of 1861, one that was more favorable to pro-slavery interests. But by then, neither section of the country wanted to compromise anymore. Lincoln left his home in Springfield, Illinois, and traveled to Washington by train. Lincoln would never see his home state again. Lincoln entered Washington at night for fear that his arrival might inspire riots in the city, which was thoroughly pro-slavery, and surrounded by the slave states of Virginia and Maryland, which, as of yet, were still in the Union. General Winfield Scott, the senior commander of the U.S. military, promised to protect the president-elect and make sure that the law was fulfilled, although he added that he preferred Bell and the Constitutional Union Party to the Republicans. Lincoln's inauguration on March 4, 1861, went off without a hitch. In his speech, Lincoln was diplomatic to the southern states. He declared that secession was legally void, but he also referred to the secessionists as friends. He also reminded them in his campaign pledge that he had no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. At this point, tensions between the seceded southern states and the Union were at a boiling point, but the war had not yet begun. The Confederate and southern state governments had begun to seize federal property, forts and arsenals in the southern states, and Lincoln had allowed this if it meant keeping the peace. In spite of Lincoln's forbearance, the Confederates refused to join the Union, fearing that Lincoln was a puppet being controlled by the more anti-slavery William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State. President Lincoln quickly realized the Southern states were determined not to come back into the Union peaceably, and were indeed getting stronger, gathering troops and materiel, and preparing to seize more federal property in the South. Back during the secession winter, and before the inauguration of Lincoln, the focus of both the U.S. and Confederate governments had been on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Fort Sumter was in a strategic location, built on a small artificial island blocking the entrance into one of the South's largest port cities. The Confederate States of America would need to control this redoubt if it were to be an independent nation. The Union was also unwilling to give up this important fort as well. Additionally, the fort had thick brick walls and several pieces of heavy artillery, although the fort was unfinished and lacked its full complement of heavy guns. The fort, if occupied, could not be taken without a difficult fight. The fort, isolated in Charleston Harbor and surrounded by water, had been left unoccupied due to the fact that it was unfinished. On December 26, 1860, Major Robert Anderson, a commander of the U.S. artillery garrison at Charleston, secretly left the city for Fort Sumter under cover of night and without orders. Anderson, by the way, was a Kentuckian and a slave owner, although he was a committed Unionist. The South Carolinian and Confederate governments ordered that Anderson and his troops give up Fort Sumter. Then President Buchanan refused, allowing Anderson to stay, and sent ships to resupply Anderson and his men in the fort. On January 9, 1861, still before Lincoln's inauguration, Confederate forces began to fire in the direction of the supply ships, preventing them from resupplying Anderson's men, who were beginning to run out of food and water in the fort. President Lincoln, after his inauguration in April, prepared to relieve Anderson's force, but he held off, knowing that resupplying the fort would be considered an act of war against the Confederate States of America, the Union's own southern states. Lincoln hoped that the Confederates would make the first move. They granted his wish in the morning hours of April 12, 1861, when Edmund Ruffin, an elderly, silver-haired Virginian planter, fired the first artillery shot on Fort Sumter, and of the Civil War. The Confederates fired on the fort, and Anderson's troops returned fire for over 34 hours. Running out of ammunition and suffocating from smoke, Anderson surrendered. Miraculously, there were no casualties in the Battle of Fort Sumter, although a Union soldier died after the battle ended when his cannon exploded. Thus, with the shelling of Fort Sumter, the antebellum period ended, and the American Civil War had begun. President Lincoln, vindicated by the fact that the Confederates had taken the first shots of the war, felt justified to call for 75,000 volunteer militia soldiers. This call for troops angered the upper southern states, who felt that the executive call was a violation of their states' rights. Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia joined the CSA, albeit more slowly and reluctantly than the Deep South had. Other slave states, Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, and Missouri, did not join the CSA. Kentucky and Maryland had both an official Union and unofficial Confederate government. Missouri was quickly occupied by the Union Army, preventing its secession. Lincoln took a more hands-off approach with Kentucky, which had proclaimed its quote-unquote armed neutrality. Confederate forces eventually invaded Kentucky, pushing the state firmly into the Union camp. Maryland, like Missouri, was occupied by federal troops to prevent its secession and to secure Washington, D.C. Though it was a slave state, Delaware remained loyal to the Union. It was the only Union slave state that provided no military units to the Confederacy. The Civil War had begun, and the battle lines had been drawn. We will discuss the Civil War itself in the next video. In the end, the antebellum period was a time of difficult change and transition for the people of the United States. Enslaved black Americans continued to suffer in their bondage, and free blacks dealt with racism and discrimination across the country. Native Americans and Mexican Americans in the West faced violence and discrimination as well, as more white settlers migrated to the region, seeking gold and land. White Americans in the North and South were becoming increasingly divided over the issue of slavery. A series of compromises and legal decisions, which had been intended to diffuse this contentious issue, just made each section more angry. Finally, the election of Abraham Lincoln, who only received votes in the northern and Pacific states, led the Deep South to secede from the Union. The Deep South states argued that Lincoln and the Republicans' plans to ban slavery from the Western territories was only a prelude to the banning of slavery in the South, hence their decision to flee the Union. The upper Southern states had slavery as well, and threats to the institution motivated their decision to leave the Union, although the perceived threat of their states' rights in the form of Lincoln's call for troops was the last straw, leading to their final departure. While many Americans think of the antebellum period as simpler, more elegant, and a more slow-paced time in American history, with its palatial plantation mansions and its graceful Southern belles, they often forget the bigotry, violence, and intense political division of the period. It is a time in U.S. history to which no one, of any race, should want to return.